The key to being disease-free is being seed oil-free. You don't need oils. Historically, most populations never cooked with oil. They cooked with butter. They did cook with olive oil where they had olive oil, but the huge majority of the world historically did not have access to olive oil. Most of the world is cooking in butter or lard historically. The enormous majority of people, you talk to them about vegetables, they'll say, I don't use any vegetable oils. The same people that are consuming 80 grams a day, like the typical American, because you don't need to buy any vegetable oil or pour any vegetable oil into your food to get 80 grams a day. Why? Because you're getting it in your processed foods, restaurant foods, and fast foods. It's all in there already. And this is why people don't think about it. I think nuts and seeds are contributing to the problem if people overindulge in those. It's not natural to eat handfuls and handfuls of nuts year round. That doesn't make any sense from an ancestral point of view. And so we shouldn't be doing that. And I think it's part of the problem.
Awesome, guys. We have Dr. Chris Knobbe here today to talk to us about a number of things. And more importantly, we've got a new book from him that I've got a copy of. I've been reading it. It's quite interesting. It's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution: How Vegetable Oils and Processed Food Destroy Our Health and How to Recover. Chris, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I got to meet you for the first time in Denver at Low Carb Denver just a couple weeks ago. So it's a pleasure meeting you, and thanks for doing this. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, it was great to meet at Low Carb Denver. That was a great meeting.
Yeah, it was. So anyway, I guess for folks that just don't know who the heck you are and any of your work or haven't seen some of your videos, give us a quick background of your background.
Sure. So I'm a physician specialized in ophthalmology and spent an entire career in ophthalmology practice, and really through my own suffering, mostly with arthritis, I started getting involved in nutrition back in 2011 and developed a hypothesis that processed foods are driving age-related macular degeneration, the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And I researched that for about a year and a half, and I was so convinced that hypothesis held water that I left practice to pursue that in 2011. And left practice in 2015. And I've been doing this ever since. In the last 4 or 5 years, really, I've just focused greatly on the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils and how they're so strongly linked to overweight and chronic disease, heart disease, strokes, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's, dementia, the autoimmune disorders, the list goes on and on. So that's really pretty much my background, Shawn.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting because about 2015 is when I stepped away from clinical practice as well and have been focusing on the lifestyle aspect of it and how it so clearly has a role there. And the interesting thing, one of the things that I point to the fact that I don't think red meat in particular causes a problem, because I've got a bunch of people that eat nothing but red meat and they're not getting sick, they're getting healthier. But when it comes to things like vegetable oils, there's nobody's eating just vegetable oils. Nobody's on an all vegetable oil diet. I can't imagine who the hell would want to do that. Gosh, can you imagine your whole diet is soybean oil or corn oil? It wouldn't work too well. So how do we go about it? And I say that a little bit facetiously because like I said, I have been making my way through your book, and it is quite an impressive book, and it's obviously well cited, and it's got just a lot of information in there. But how did you come to the conclusion or make the argument that it is in fact these highly processed vegetable oils that are problematic? How did you come up with that?
A lot of different things, Shawn. I would say that number one, this goes back to the research of Weston A. Price back in the 1930s, as he connected processed foods, Westernized diets to physical degenerative disease, which at that time he primarily focused on birth defects and dental decay and arthritis, cancers, and so on. But he included in his list refined flours, sugars, canned goods, sweets, confectionery, and vegetable fats, he called them. And that's what was probably my first link to the belief system that vegetable oils were a problem. And when I left practice, we looked at the data on sugar and vegetable oil consumption data in 25 nations. And in those, this is what struck me so greatly, is that it was the vegetable oils that were the primary drivers of macular degeneration. We saw, and we would see in like South Pacific Islands where the vegetable oil consumption was almost zero. But even if the sugar consumption was high, they had virtually almost zero macular degeneration. And so I would say that was a big turning point for me, seeing that. And in the rodent studies, so in animal studies, we see that animals that are put on, for example, 19% vegetable oil diet, which is about 11% omega-6 linoleic acid, lower than Americans are consuming today. These animals become morbidly obese. They develop insulin resistance, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and will grow to about a third to half this, or I should say, it will increase their weight a third to a half of their normal weight, additional, if I'm making sense there, and they don't need any sugar to accomplish that. In fact, in at least one study, sugar was protective of these animals gaining weight and developing liver disease. So it's that. And then we've looked at all this data, which is in the book, in country after country. What we see is vegetable oils going up. And even when sugars, carbohydrates, and total calories are going down, we see marked increases in obesity, in diabetes, in metabolic syndrome, in macular degeneration, and in cancer. Yeah. And of course, we've seen an enormous increase in coronary heart disease since the 19th century. It was an extraordinarily rare disorder in the 19th century, and then has exploded in virtually every country that has incorporated vegetable oils, which now is all of them. So they're all consuming vegetable oil. I don't know of a single country that's not consuming these polyunsaturated vegetable oils.
Yeah. If you look at the cover of your book, you've got a container, a bottle of vegetable oil, and it's got a skull and crossbones and then chronic metabolic poison listed underneath it. First of all, how much do we consume of this calorically, percentage of our diet? Why does the average, say, Western diet, or particularly American, because I'm sure you have data on that, how much are we consuming these days?
In the United States, as of 2010, we're at 80 grams a day per person per day. Okay. And to give a historical perspective, it was 0 grams a day in 1865, right at the end of the American Civil War. We were at approximately 1 gram a day, or close to between 1 and 2 grams a day in 1900 and 1909. 1961, we were at 19 grams a day. And then 2010, 80 grams a day. So
so Chris, because a lot of people maybe don't understand the value of that, because 80 grams a day, it's all fats. It's 720 calories a day. And the average person is consuming 2,400 calories a day. That's more than it's like a third of our calories are coming from pure vegetable oil. That's a lot. That's a significant amount.
Exactly, Shawn. It's 32% of caloric intake in 2010. Now, that's not corrected for losses. So if you're going to have some plate losses and some restaurant losses and so forth. So it might be a little lower on average, but no lower than 24%. And for a lot of people, it's going to be higher. So yeah, it's around a quarter to a third of the American diet are these vegetable oils. And here, they're almost all the bad ones. There's very little overall consumption of olive oil or coconut oil, these good ones. Now, worldwide, if you go back to 1865, we're also at effectively zero globally, 0 per capita per day. And as of 2016, I believe it was, we were at around 65 grams per person per day. Now, globally, some of those are much better oils like palm oil and some coconut oil and some olive oil. The United States, of course, leads the way in consuming the worst oils, the highly polyunsaturated seed oils. But globally, yeah, we're consuming an extraordinary amount of oils. And with that, globally, as we become markedly more obese, diabetic, and greatly more metabolic syndrome just in the last 20, 30, 40 years, the whole world's becoming overweight, obese, and sick.
Yeah. And you're not obviously the first person to make this argument. Again, Tucker Goodrich I've had on, he's discussed about the problems of particularly oxidized omega-6 fatty acids, which is, some people don't realize omega-6 fatty acids are a requirement. We have to have some in our diet. We must have some to survive as humans. Same thing with omega-3s. But what do you think is going on? Because where do we find these foods? Almost undoubtedly it's in processed foods. No one is per se drinking corn oil straight up. So is it maybe just the confounding of the fact that they're always found in processed foods typically, or is there something biochemically going on? And if so, what is that?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of those things, Shawn. So first of all, the omega-6 linoleic acid, the primary omega-6, it counts for about 90% of the omega-6 in any diet. And omega-3 alpha linolenic acid, these are essential fatty acids. And this has been known since Burr and Burr's research back in the 1930s that you have to have these two fatty acids in order to have health, to be able to grow and have normal skin and teeth and eyes and all that. So they must be in the diet. But the interesting thing is, if you eat food, you cannot get too little omega-6 linoleic acid. I'm absolutely convinced, because all food contains omega-6 linoleic acid, or LA. It doesn't matter if you're eating 100% oranges or apples or white rice, things that you would think don't have any fat at all. Even protein powder contains fat, and that fat will contain omega-6 linoleic acid and omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. And you only need about 0.5% of your diet to get of omega-6 linoleic acid to be sufficient. So I'm convinced anything more than 2% is too much. And I think that's well accepted by researchers like Artemis Simopoulos, who popularized the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. She's been studying this for 30 years, and she believes that we don't need more than 2% omega-6 linoleic acid in our diet. And we're absolutely convinced that you're better off being lower than that. And again, it's just virtually impossible to get too little. But the problem with omega-6 linoleic acid is we accumulate it. We accumulate it in our body fat. So if you eat too much, those omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, they will reflect their concentrations in your body fat based on the ratios or the amounts that are in your diet. So the more of this omega-6 you consume in your diet, the more you will have in your body fat. And the higher that goes, that sets up a biological milieu that is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And I say these are the four pillars of hazard. You put those together and you have the recipe for disaster. And yes, these are in sufficient quantities. That this omega-6 it's the recipe for disaster. It leads to all of this chronic metabolic disease, and I think it's by far and away the primary contributor to obesity.
Yeah, I know you covered this in the book, but I'll let you talk about it here. But how do we assess that we're accumulating that? I know there's biopsy studies in humans from back in the day versus more recent studies. How do those compare? And I know there are different cultures and different populations, because I know as reading your book, you talk about this particular population had this percentage of body fat like this. How do those numbers look?
Yeah, so in order to analyze it, you really can't analyze your fatty acids very well, very accurately, as far as I know, by studying the blood. You have to go out, you have to get the fat, you have to get the adipose, the body fat. And so you biopsy the body fat either in the buttocks or in the abdomen. Typically, it just takes a very tiny amount. And then you run a fatty acid analysis and you look at, you have to use gas chromatography or high performance liquid chromatography to determine what those fatty acids are, which has been available since 1952, by the way. And so in general, whatever the omega-6 linoleic acid is in your in your diet, it will approximately over 3 years or more double in your body fat. And so there are 4 populations that I'm aware of, and only 4 in all of history that were consuming, as close as I can tell, a completely ancestral diet, meaning they did not have any vegetable oils in their diet, and they also had adipose biopsies, and this was done in 1969 by Ian Pryor and colleagues, and they did these adipose biopsies on the Maori of New Zealand, Europeans of New Zealand, and then Pukapukans of 2 islands, Puka Puka and Rarotonga. And they all ranged between right at about 2.6 and 3.2% omega-6 linoleic acid in their body fat. So they averaged 2.86% in their body fat. That means they were consuming around 1 or 1.5% of their diet as omega-6 linoleic acid. Now, let me compare that to all of the studies of adipose biopsies and fatty acid analyses in Westernized populations since 1990. They are now averaging, I believe it's 14 point something or other percent in their body fat. And Americans, we were at 9.1% omega-6 linoleic acid in our body fat back in 1959. And that increased all the way to 21.5% omega-6 linoleic acid, again, in our body fat by 2008. That was Stephan Guyenet's published research. He collected all the adipose biopsy studies on Americans done between the 1950s and as recent as possible, which the latest was 2008. And that's what they came up with. So again, we should be, our omega-6 linoleic acid in our body fat should be under 4% for sure. It really probably should be under 3%. And we were in the United States, 9.1% in 1959 and 21.5% in 2008. And the world collectively is around 14.5% or so in the last 25 years. So you can just see they all track together as the whole world has gotten overweight, obese, and developed more and more diabetes and metabolic syndrome. This adipose omega-6 linoleic acid tracks perfectly with that.
So that leads to a couple of questions. One, obviously, if it's in the adipose tissue, I would assume it's in every cell in our body because all of our cellular membranes are lipid-based. And so I would imagine it incorporates there to include our brain and central nervous system. How much, because you mentioned under 3%, how does that, like I said, somebody's asking about what is the minimum threshold before you start getting into trouble, knowing that we do have to have some omega-6 in our diet. There's an amount where it becomes, now it's problematic. Do we have an idea where that threshold is? What's the minimum we should, or the maximum we should strive to get as far as how much, when do we get in trouble?
Yeah, I think anything over 2% omega-6 linoleic acid in the diet is trouble. And if we look at Clement Ip, it's IP, I believe his research on this subject was published in 1987. He ran a bunch of studies on rodents where he controlled the omega-6 linoleic acid in their diet at 0.5% intervals. So he started at 0.5% and then 1%, 1.5%. I think it went all the way up to 10 or 12%, which, by the way, is where Americans are today. Again, like I said, we were at 11.8% by 2008. And then he treated these animals with a carcinogen, DMBA, and then followed them for the development of mammary tumors, so that's the equivalent of breast cancer. And these animals, as the omega-6 went up from 0.5%, they developed increasingly higher numbers of mammary cancers up until 4.4% omega-6 LA in their diet. And then after that, it leveled off. So there's a threshold effect. And I guess the point of this, at least in relation to cancer, is that when you're above 4.4%, you're already maxed out in terms of your risk of cancer. You really should, as I mentioned, you should be under 2% in your diet. And every ancestral diet accomplishes that. I mean, as long as you don't have, as long as you're not consuming vegetable oils of any type and you're not consuming CAFO-raised animals, particularly chicken and pigs that are fed corn and soy, which raises their body fat, omega-6 LA, and you're not consuming significant amounts of nuts and seeds, you will have an omega-6 LA in your diet that's under 2%. And so, but you know, this is the one thing that, as I look at these different ancestrally living populations around the world, this is the one thing that they all share in common, is they're all under 2% omega-6 linoleic acid.
Let me ask you, you know, as far as, you know, you said this accumulates in our fat and our cell membranes, it potentially leads to problems, and we'll get into why we think that is, but can we remove this from our cells? How long does it take? What is the half-life? Is it just avoiding it? Is there something else we can do in addition to facilitate the reduction in the linoleic acid accumulation in our body?
Yeah, so I think that number one is, of course, you need, if you want to get this out of your body, meaning get your omega-6 down to natural, healthy levels, you've got to eliminate the sources of it, as I said, which would be the vegetable oils, nuts and seeds, and animals, again, monogastric animals like pigs and chicken that are consuming CAFO, that are raised in CAFOs and fed GMO corn and soy. Okay, that'll get your levels down. Okay, but let's assume you've been doing all the wrong things and you're like the typical American and you've got 21.5% of your body fat as omega-6 LA, and it really should be under 4% and probably under 3%. So what do? Number one, You do what I said, you eliminate those big sources. Number two is you can exercise because you can burn these omega-6 and even the omega-3s. You can burn those for fuel. So exercise will help you. And interestingly, if you don't know what you're doing, an extreme low-fat diet actually might be a way to burn these faster. I'm really not suggesting that's the way to go, but it seems to work. But other than that, okay. And back to your question about the half-life. So the half-life of omega-6 LA in the body is 600 to 680 days. So you can just round that off. It's approximately 2 years. And the total turnover, I've only seen this published in one paper, shows or suggests that the entire turnover of fat in the body it takes place in 3 years. So this means that even if you're not doing anything special like exercising or whatever, if you just stop consuming high omega-6, you get your omega-6 down to 1%, roughly like it should be, then in 3 years, you should have an ancestrally appropriate level of linoleic acid in your body fat.
There's obviously people that very vehemently disagree that vegetable oils are problematic. There's people like some folks like Walter Willard at Harvard would say, actually, it's preferential that we eat them and we replace saturated fat with that. And one of the purported benefits is it tends to lower LDL cholesterol. What are your thoughts on that sort of line of thinking that we should preferentially eat these things rather than, oh my gosh, eating butter and eggs and bacon and meat and things like that? What do you say to the critics that say that this actually lowers heart disease?
So yeah, Harvard, Tufts, Mayo Clinics, their nutrition departments, the American Heart Association, and some other major nutrition institutions, they're all telling us to consume these vegetable oils and that they are, quote, heart healthy. And, Shawn, I've been looking at this evidence now for very full time since 2014, 2015. And the only thing I can figure out, there's only one reason they suggest consuming these vegetable oils, and it is because they lower LDL cholesterol. And I don't think that is any benefit whatsoever. And they lower that LDL cholesterol at the expense of causing it to be oxidized. So James DeNicolantonio has written a really great paper, and I can't remember the exact title, but it refers to the omega-6 linoleic acid hypothesis of coronary heart disease. And he and his colleague author tie together numerous studies that show us and tell us that it is the omega-6 linoleic acid that is incorporated into the LDL. And because these are unsaturated fats, they are the ones that oxidize. They oxidize and are converted into downstream metabolic end products like 9 and 13-HODE and malondialdehyde. And when this happens, this causes the LDL, which is now oxidized LDL, to be taken up through the endothelium of our vasculature. And this is what begins and propagates atherosclerotic plaques. And so this indeed does lower your LDL measured in the blood, but at the expense of causing the thing that you're trying to prevent. So this is actually causing atherosclerosis. And so I am convinced that it is, I think it's probably almost impossible to cause heart disease without any vegetable oils in the diet. You just, in every population I've looked at ancestrally, including Americans in the 19th century, we just didn't have heart disease, and you don't see heart disease until you put vegetable oils in the diet.
I know there was some evidence of maybe some of the Egyptian mummies where they supposed to have that. What are your thoughts on that? I know there's some things people, they were cooking indoors and a lot of smoke and those types of things. And we know that smoke can be clearly an inflammatory thing. Thoughts on that particular phenomenon, or if it's even real?
Yeah, I think it is real. And to my knowledge, Shawn, you can correct me if you know differently. They were producing some kind of oil. I can't remember what that was, but they were producing an oil, and they were consuming, all I know is they were consuming grains and some type of oil, which I do believe that those Egyptian mummies did have coronary heart disease. And I know Mike Eads presented on this back at Low Carb Denver 2020. And I can't remember the name of the book, but I ended up getting that book. And I believe that's all correct. So once again, I think it was vegetable oils that I think are the primary driver there.
Yeah, I don't know. I certainly, they were obviously grain-based, and obviously they're exposed to smoke, and I know they had sugary things in their diet and things like that. But let me ask, so there's obviously correlative data. We can look at the vegetable oil consumption graph where it goes up pretty dramatically over the last 50 years particularly, and then we see, a very corresponding increases in autoimmune disease and diabetes and on. But that's all correlative, and people say that doesn't really prove anything. Where can you say that, hey, there are some actual intervention, some randomized controlled trials, some data that would say this is more than just correlation? Where would you say that is?
First of all, I think that we see some of that in the Minnesota Coronary Survey and the LA American Veterans Trials. We see some of this. Of course, those people are mostly dying of more cancer. I would say the problem with it has been, always will be, the fact that we're never going to have any randomized controlled trials on conditions, on these chronic diseases that have incubation periods that are decades. And this is the way I view this, is that how often do we see heart attacks in people under 30 or even 40? It takes decades for coronary heart disease to materialize with the wrong diet. It's the same situation for a lot of cancers, for macular degeneration, for Alzheimer's, for dementia. And so we're never going to have randomized controlled clinical trials where we've split people up into two groups and then followed them, unless we're going to follow them for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So it's impractical, and it can't be done. The longest I've ever seen of any controlled trials that completely controlled diets, I've not seen any longer than 6 months, because you got to put people into a metabolic ward and control everything they eat, and they can't leave, because if they leave, then they go to McDonald's and have a hamburger and French fries and a Coke, and you're screwed. This is why I have focused so heavily on population studies, and people will argue, okay, that's just observation. Can't glean anything from observational studies, but yet that's what we do all the time. Most everything we do in medicine is based on observation, and it's not based on randomized controlled trials. I think it's a very small percentage. I can't remember what it is. It's something like 14% or something. I don't remember the exact number, but it's very low. So when we look at populations, if we have people in their natural environment, they're eating a natural diet, they're doing the normal things, and we can observe them as we have in this research for well over a century, like we have in the United States and actually some other smaller populations that we've been able to observe for long periods of time. So I think we have to, in my view, Shawn, I think we have to rely heavily on population studies. And again, because we're never going to have long-term controlled clinical trials on coronary heart disease and dementia and Alzheimer's and all that. It's never going to happen.
Yeah, I concur. Those studies are either unethical or too expensive, or they're just technically too hard to do. And so we're always limited by across the board on nutrition. And so it's one unfortunate. It's not a very hard science, it's a soft science in that regard. As far as, I'm just wondering if there's anything like reintroduction and removal and reintroduction. So I know there was a study on dementia patients where they removed statins and their cognition got better. Then they reintroduced the statins and their cognition got worse. And then they took them out again and they got better again, I believe. And so can we look at anything like that? You add seed oils into the diet and something negative happens, and you remove them, something positive happens. Is there any information around that that's occurred?
Not in humans. Obviously, there's been a lot of animal studies that have put these animals on diets, as I said, that were just typical levels of seed oils, and these animals become, if you put just for example, you put these animals, rodents, on just a typical seed oil diet, typical of Western populations, like 19%, 20% seed oil, which is around 10, 11% omega-6 linoleic acid. Within a month, these animals will be insulin resistant, and within 2 months, they'll be diabetic. And you probably could do the very same thing in humans. I think you could probably induce, it hasn't been done because we haven't controlled any diets in humans in this regard yet, as far as I'm aware, but I think you probably do the exact same thing in humans. I think you can produce metabolic disease and diabetes very rapidly. And you can also reverse it pretty rapidly, not nearly, you can't reverse it nearly as fast, but there's evidence for that too, by removing all the seed oils.
Yeah, I mean, for whatever, a lot of people will, carnivore diet obviously removes all that. And I see those things improving all the time. Now, whether it's removal of the seed oils or the processed food or something else, it's hard to say, but certainly we know that, at least in that example, we see improvements all the time. Let me, because Chris, you're an ophthalmologist, you operate on people's eyes, or you had a career doing that, and you've talked about macular degeneration. What is the mechanism by which you think macular degeneration is occurring, and can we treat? Is it reversible? Can we treat it? What has your experience with macular degeneration been with diet?
Yeah, I would say of all the conditions that we're concerned about, I know that coronary heart disease seems like a very complicated disease, and probably it is, but I think that age-related macular degeneration is probably by far the most complex, and it's just because the eye is so fantastically complex, and so there's many different arrows all coming together that produce this disease. And so I think it's a combination of, number one is the seed oils are driving a number of issues, including direct damage to the retinal pigment epithelium, and the retinal pigment epithelium, or the RPE, supports the photoreceptors, which are the rods and cones. And so the seed oils, high omega-6, is directly toxic to the retinal pigment epithelium. When people are consuming high omega-6 diets, they are also virtually always deficient, I believe, in the fat-soluble vitamins, because they're not consuming animal fats generally to the degree that they should be. And so they're deficient in vitamins A, D, and K2. And so that contributes to damage to the RPE. Along with this, we get thickening of what's called Brooks membrane. It's a membrane between the RPE and the photoreceptors. And that membrane, Brooks membrane, thickens in a way that is absolutely analogous to the development of an atherosclerotic plaque. So it thickens and it calcifies just like an atherosclerotic plaque. It creates a barrier between the RPE and the photoreceptors, which then creates a problem with the transmission of nutrients back and forth and even gas exchange back and forth. So now we've created yet another problem. Next, you have atherosclerotic disease of the vasculature, especially that beneath the retinal pigment epithelium, which is the choriocapillaris and the choroid. And it's not direct atherosclerosis in the choroid, but there's great evidence that these vessels, actually, even in vitamin A deficiency alone, this vasculature tends to atrophy. And so now you're taking away the blood supply. Anyway, so you have reduced blood supply, you have thickening of Brooks membrane, you have damage to the retinal pigment epithelium, which then atrophies and dies, and hence the rods and cones die. And that's the basic fundamentals of what's going on in the eye and how we get to macular degeneration. But ultimately, you're getting death of RPE cells and death of rods and cones, and which are the photoreceptors. And unfortunately, none of those are regenerative. We get one set of those and they never, ever come back. So in the early stages of macular degeneration, when we just see drusen, these metabolic deposits, those are reversible. And I've seen this happen in my own patients who went on clean diets when they got macular degeneration. And I've seen reversal of the drusen, these metabolic deposits. But that's generally before the RPE cells and the photoreceptors have died, essentially atrophied, or it underwent apoptosis, whatever you want to call it. So you can begin to reverse the disease early, but when you've lost RPE and photoreceptors, whatever you've lost, it's permanent. And so this is why, just like in stroke or heart attacks or dementia or Alzheimer's disease, prevention is key. So we've got to get at people before they've gone down a really bad path.
Yeah, in the comments, one of our listeners, Charlie, says his wife was early stage macular degeneration, type 2 diabetic, went carnivore a couple of years, now the eyes are clear. And apparently she was probably at that early threshold stage where it can be reversible. You mentioned, because a lot of us eat meat here in this group, in fact, all of us do, and some people are consuming pork and chicken, probably some of it's coming from CAFOs. I'm just wondering, because like chickens and pigs, we are also monogastric animals. And so why is it when they're eating chicken, or not, where they're eating grain, soybeans, things like that, particularly cows don't really get that, but chickens and pigs tend to get soy more so than cows ever do. What is causing them to turn that nutrition into linoleic acid in their fat? And does the same thing happen to us? So if I'm eating a grain-based diet, will I accumulate linoleic acid even though I'm not eating it? Is that a potential possibility?
Yeah. So the difference is, number one, those animals, like the chickens and pigs, which are omnivores, and they should be eating a diet more like humans, right? They should be eating meat, little critters, animals, and vegetables, fruits, all those kinds of things. And when they're put on these diets that are almost strictly corn and soy, which are richer in omega-6, they because they're monogastric, they have no way to hydrogenate those unsaturated fats into saturated or monounsaturated fats. So they accumulate them just like we do. So I found studies that on of chickens and pigs that were raised ancestrally in Tokelau way back in the 60s and 70s, and their body fat, omega-6 linoleic acid, was 2.5% in chickens and 2% in the pigs, I believe. And but chickens and pigs fed corn and soy. And you can find this all over the place. There's lots of studies that have shown this, that their body fat, omega-6 linoleic acid, runs up around 20% or even higher. And that's exactly, of course, that's what happens to humans, given that we're monogastric and we can't hydrogenate those fats. Now, if we contrast that to cattle, the herbivores, the ungulates, that have multi-compartment stomachs, they have a biohydrogenation chamber in one of those stomachs, and the organisms within their gut will hydrogenate these omega-6 fats into saturated fat or monounsaturated fat. So cattle will maintain a very low level of omega-6 in their body fat no matter what you feed them. If they just eat nothing but corn and soy, they'll still have roughly 3% or so omega-6 linoleic acid in their body fat, and they'll be more like 2% if they're on 100% grass. So it's not a huge difference. So this is why if people can only afford CAFO type meat, I say eat beef, because it's going to be low in omega-6 linoleic acid, whereas the chicken and the pork won't be.
Yeah, I guess, Kristen, I'm trying to come to terms with, if a pig eats corn and soy, it accumulates linoleic acid because it can't process correctly. But what about if humans eat soy and corn? Do we accumulate linoleic acid as well, or do we know? Is that a possible? Because maybe that explains what the Egyptians were doing. I don't know.
Yeah, I've never seen anything about that. And I just think it's primarily the amount, Shawn. That would be my guess. Never really. You're asking me something I hadn't given a lot of thought to, but I think it must primarily be the fact that we're not living on it like those animals. If that's all we ate, it might be a problem. I'm really not sure.
Yeah, and I don't know much about finishing and feeding pigs and chickens relative. I know quite a bit more about cows because I tend to eat them, but
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe somebody knows how much of a chicken feed is actual corn or soy, or a pig's ration. It might be 50% or more. I don't know. It could be quite high. So that's an interesting thought. What do you think is going on? There's some people talk about the fact that different compounds are formed in the processing of these oils. Now, clearly, these seed oils, I don't care what. When we talk about an ancestral argument, no one would agree that prior to basically cotton gin and beyond, do we have any exposure to these oils for the most part? Soybean oil was not a thing until 18 something, I'm sure. What do you think? Is it the way these things are processed? Because if I'm eating a handful of cashews or something like that, it's got some of this in there, but the processing, the concentration, the heating, the hexane solvents, does that confer additional concern to these things?
Yes, absolutely. And that's all been shown in many different studies. Martin Greutfeld in the UK has done, he's a analytical chemist, has done a lot of work in this area. And so they analyzed many different oils from restaurants, like fast food restaurants, where they've been heating these oils for days. And so they found all of these at high levels of advanced lipid oxidation end products. And again, these are the downstream chemical products that come from the oxidation of linoleic acid. And there are things like 4-hydroxynonenal, 4-H&E, malondialdehyde, MDA, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein. And what struck me was these are just the ones that we name, Shawn, and there's literally hundreds of these advanced lipid oxidation end products. So they're just chemical names. And God only knows what those are doing to us. But just the 4-H&E, malondialdehyde, carboxyethylpyrrole, acrolein, they are not only in the oils at much higher levels when they've been heated. You'll develop them when you cook with them at home, or when, naturally when they're, used in restaurants and they're heated for long periods of time. But you also will develop all of these physiologically, or maybe I should say pathophysiologically, in the body even if you consume non-heated oils and you produce higher levels of omega-6 linoleic acid in your body fat, those will oxidize. And when they oxidize, they'll produce these exact same chemicals endogenously. So whether you get them exogenously or endogenously, if I can get that out, in both cases, you're ending up with a very problematic situation. Now, are we better off with things that are high omega-6 that don't have those, like nuts and seeds? They're just natural. And I think assuredly the answer is yes. But I think nuts and seeds are contributing to the problem if people overindulge in those. It's not natural to eat handfuls and handfuls of nuts year round. That doesn't make any sense from an ancestral point of view. And so we shouldn't be doing that. And I think it's part of the problem. And I don't know of any evidence other than in any ancestral populations of consuming large amounts of nuts, other than I think there's a population or two in Africa that consume mongongo nuts, but they eat those because they're starving. There's nothing else to eat.
Yeah. I think sometimes we conflate these indigenous populations that are on the brink of starvation and say that's how we're supposed to eat, when they're out there eating baboon testicles and things like that because that's all they can get a hold of. Now,
yeah.
Let me ask you, Chris, because there's a lot of these different oils on the market. There's corn oil, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, or canola oil. There's sunflower oil, safflower oil. Is there a continuum on which ones are the worst of the worst offenders that you can think of as this is the worst of the worst type of thing?
Yeah, and I primarily would rank those based on how high their linoleic acid is, and we've got those charts in this new book coming out, which that's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. But just really quickly, I'll just say, here's my list, Shawn. Yeah, thank you. It's the oils we want to avoid for sure: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, and I think we should avoid sesame and peanut oils too, really. They certainly have a better track record, those two, sesame and peanut. They were used in Asian cultures, and it's because they're not heated for the most part. You can press those oils. It's a little bit more like olive oil. But those are the ones that you should definitely avoid if you're going to consume oils. And I think coconut and palm kernel, they're both 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. Those would be your safest oils of all. And then olive oil falls in the middle. It can be a very healthy oil. Problem with it, 79% of the olive oil in the US is either adulterated or it's not of good quality, doesn't meet good quality standards set forth by the North American Olive Oil Association. Most people that think they're getting olive oil, they're really getting adulterated oil. It's been adulterated with soybean oil and canola oil and other oils because it's a bad industry for the most part. So if you're going to eat olive oil, consume olive oil, just make absolutely sure that it's authentic, it's fresh, and it's properly stored.
You had mentioned that even in light of sugar potentially even being mitigated in some of these cases, but historically we certainly have examples of obese characters in history. Henry VIII and some of these other people that were really fat. They didn't have the new seed oils that we have now. Could it be that they were over consuming pastries and treats and things like that? Can we just eat unlimited? If we just cook it with butter and sugar and flour and make cakes all day long, is this still going to be a problem for us if we're not including those oils? Or what are your thoughts on that type of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. People have always been able to become obese throughout history. I think it was difficult. I think they just almost had to force themselves to overeat. And of course, in some societies, being obese was revered, right? Because only the rich could eat enough, could get enough food and just eat enough and be lazy enough, apparently, maybe to become overweight. So that's one of the reasons. And so I think you alluded to the other reasons. People have always there's always an opportunity to eat less nutritious food even if you're consuming whole grains and it's cake and pastries or whatever, like you mentioned, Shawn. I think that if that's what your primary food is, yeah, you're headed down a bad path.
Yeah, and mentioning, because you talk about these oils, and a lot of these people say, what am I going to cook in? I'm used to putting canola oil in the pan and frying up my whatever. What do we use instead? I know I probably know where the answer is going, but just for the sake of completeness, what do you suggest we use to cook with, to bake with, to cook our food with, cook our meat with? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say we use butter for everything. If you need a lot of oil, I would say probably try to use coconut oil. It's 2% omega-6 linoleic acids. I think it's probably the safest oil there is, other than palm kernel, which has a lot of antioxidants too. So that's very safe, but might impart a flavor to some foods. So those would be the safe ones. But I'd say in general, you don't need oils. Historically, most populations never cooked with oil. They cooked with butter where they had butter, and they did cook with olive oil where they had olive oil, but the huge majority of the world historically did not have access to olive oil. So most of the world was cooking with butter and then lard, or possibly maybe even some beef tallow, but most of the world is cooking in butter or lard historically.
Yeah, interesting. And as far as, because I know part of this book talks about vegetables and processed foods, where does the processed food part of this come into the equation? Is it, if we were to remove the vegetable oils from the processed foods, and would we be okay, or is it still a problem?
I think we'd end up just much more like all the people that Weston Price found that were consuming processed foods. They didn't have many vegetable oils in that era, in the 1930s, but they were eating a lot of sugar and refined flour, canned goods, confectionery. And so with that, you're heading down the path of degenerative disease because you're just not getting enough vitamins and minerals. So if you took the vegetable oils out of the equation, I think you'd almost eliminate most of the overweight, obesity, but if your diet is processed and low omega-6, then I think you're going to head down the path of degenerative disorders, and that's going to give you, again, like dental decay, arthritis, and even cancers. But it's a mixed bag, and it's hard to completely separate the two, because this has been one of the problems all along, is sugar and vegetable oils run together because processed food is, by my definition, refined flour, sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fats. It's primarily those, with all the mystery ingredients that these food engineers throw in there to make us want to eat more. But it's really those four things.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that I would just would be interested in is that there are a lot of people, plant-based diet people, vegans, that some of them are whole food, no oils, which I think is, maybe that explains a lot of it. But there are some people that are on a vegetarian or a vegan diet. They use these oils pretty copiously, and many of them are not obese. Or am I imagining that? Or what are your thoughts around that particular group of population?
Yeah, Shawn, I just haven't seen any studies to confirm that. But I just honestly, I don't have an answer for that. I really don't know for sure if that's. I just haven't seen any evidence in terms of any studies on that.
Yeah. And I guess I would just imagine you've got some vegan cooking up vegetable stir fries using canola oil. I assume those people exist. I don't know. I can't say for sure what they're eating. I would imagine just like most Americans, where they're getting their vegetable oils from is going to be from processed food. That's just where, I don't know if we've looked at that, but I would imagine by percentage, that's where probably most of it comes from. Is that fair to say, or is that not? Where does most of the linoleic acid in the American diet come from?
Oh, it's enormously just processed food. Yeah, it's processed food, restaurant food, fast food. That's where it's coming from. Because the enormous majority of people, if you talk to them about vegetables, they'll say, I don't use any vegetable oils. And they're probably the same people that are consuming 80 grams a day, like the typical American, because you don't need to buy any vegetable oil or pour any vegetable oil into your food to get 80 grams a day. Why? Because you're getting it in your processed foods, restaurant foods, and fast foods. It's all in there already. And this is why people don't think about it. They just don't recognize it.
I haven't gotten far enough into the book, and I just wonder if you comment on that. We have a lot of issues, particularly these days, even more and more so, with mental health disorders, and obviously we're seeing more and more dementia. Do we know if these linoleic acid and these oxidized oils end up in the brain? I imagine they do. Do we know definitively that it's showing up in our brain, and is there some level that it's linked to some of these mental health disorders, neurodegenerative diseases? Any evidence on that?
Yeah, it does accumulate in the brain, and we also know that, for example, H&E, the 4-H&E accumulates in the brain, and strongly suspected in Alzheimer's and dementia. And it's really interesting because even though we see a gradual accumulation of H&E in general, there are 80-year-olds that have H&E that are lower than a lot of 5-year-old children. And what does this mean? To me, it means that those 80-year-olds, they're the ones that aren't consuming vegetable oils. They probably grew up consuming a native traditional American diet, for example, or whatever, and whatever their traditional diet was. And they've avoided vegetable oils. And whereas others have extremely high levels of H&E in their brain. And those are obviously the people consuming vegetable oil. There's no other conclusion you could come to.
Sure. Chris, we're just about out of time. I want to you got the book, The Ancestral Diet Revolution. I've got a copy of it right here. I was looking in the back, there are 1,317 references in there. So it's very heavily scienced out of there. It's a very thick book with a lot of good information in there. I know it's going to take me a while to get through this. When can the general population get a hold of this? Where can they go? Any other information? Is there a website or something like that?
Yeah, so the book will be available in online book retailers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and such on May 15th. And if it's not that day, it should be within a day or two of that. But May 15th of next month. And they could come to our foundations, Cure AMD Foundation or Ancestral Health Foundation online. That's where to find us. And I've got obviously a lot of presentations of mine are on YouTube. So places like that's where they can find us, Shawn.
Yeah, the book has just got wonderful graphs and comparisons and very compelling figures in here that certainly you're going to look at that and go, wow, this is pretty compelling. So anyway, Chris, thank you so much. Any last words that you want to get in before we go?
And the last words are the key to being disease-free is being seed oil free. That's my view, and that's the take-home message. So Been a pleasure being on your show, Shawn. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Yeah, Chris, Chris, I saw there's one question that somebody's asking. I want to make sure your thoughts on lard. Is it something we should avoid? It traditionally has been used in cooking. I guess there's probably types of lard that would be better than other, leaf lard versus, I don't know. Any thoughts on lard?
Yeah, so it's the same as what we talked about earlier, really. If people can get lard that is ancestrally raised, meaning that the pig consumed a native traditional diet, which means no corn and soy. They're out, on the pasture eating the food they're supposed to. Then that will be super low omega-6 linoleic acid and be just like our 19th century American ancestors. That lard would be brilliant. It'd probably be 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. That's perfect. Right, so they can use that. But you got to find that type of lard. If it's CAFO raised lard, you might as well be consuming vegetable oil because it'll be 20% or 20% plus linoleic acid.
Okay. And are you aware of that product exists? Have you seen places that sell that maybe?
Yeah, there's very few, but you have to look around there. You can go to eatwild.com and search in your area and you'll find some ranchers that are raising pigs the way they should be. There's a few here and there.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Shawn.
We'll see everybody tomorrow morning. Take care. Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.